Okay, so let's start in. One question asks, one of the biggest barriers that the apologist faces is emotion and the different experiences of the subject or subjects and the woundedness that they've experienced. How do we keep from getting caught up in this emotion? Or can it be used in a positive way? Good question. Well, basically, I would answer that in order to properly enter into dialogue, dialogue has to be conducted by reason and not by emotion. So emotion in itself is a kind of obstacle very often for engaging reason. But not always. In other words, it's possible to channel emotion so that it helps one to see, even though normally it will have the opposite effect. What do I mean by this? Dialogue has to fundamentally appeal to reason, seeing universal principles. Emotion gets caught up in the particular. And emotion tends to sidetrack the conversation because the person isn't seeing the whole picture. They're simply focusing on what they're experiencing strong emotion about. So from that point of view, it's an obstacle to apologetics and to any kind of... but sometimes sometimes it can be helpful. How is that? We say that love... I think I talked about this earlier. We say that very often love is blind. No? And that's sometimes true and sometimes not true. Love is blind if it's infatuation. But true love, in other words, love that, say, spousal love, parental love, filial love, helps us to see. And so there's an emotion that can come from the wounds of our life that it can actually help us to see. Why? Just, for example, a parent can see the principles of sexual morality much, much more easily when their teenage daughter gets in trouble. Because they love that daughter, and therefore they can see what a disordered use of sexuality does to a person. So emotions that come from our woundedness can sometimes help us if we channel them, again, by reason in order to see. But it has to be for the purpose of seeing. Otherwise, we're stuck in the particular. And I think that's such a huge problem today, is because when we speak about the faith, generally the person is stuck in their particular experience. And that blocks dialogue. David?
How would you classify empathy?
Right, so empathy is the ability to enter into another person's world. Emotional. Both, right? So there can be an empathy from the point of view of seeing how they see, and an empathy feeling how they feel. Now, both of those aid in dialogue, there's no doubt, because especially the former, seeing how the person that you're speaking with sees the world. Feeling how they feel can help to the extent, but it always, in order to see, you have to see the universal. And so there always has to be an opening of this particular emotion.
Can you say something to aid our prayer for kind of enemies of the faith, like, for instance, Islam? Or when we're praying for our enemies, emotion is
okay, that's
one
different.
Problem.
Right.
What can you say about praying for our enemies?
All right, well, that's different. So that in that case, I mean, simply because the difficulty in the previous question is, what do you do with the unfocused emotion of the person that you're speaking with? That's very difficult. In this case, praying for someone who's done me, I have to deal with a different emotion, my own. And so there one obviously wants to ask for the grace to be able to love that person more perfectly. So that would simply be the answer there. I'm sure there's much more to be said about that question, but I'm going to... Another question asks, it seems that theology has to battle against the skepticism of modern culture. That's for sure. We witness the inconsistencies of other institutions in our culture and develop this skepticism that includes theology. In other words, theology just is seen as one more institution that we ought to be skeptical of. And perhaps the one, I would say the objection more strongly, the one that people are most skeptical of. Why most skeptical of? Because it's the church makes a claim that others don't make. Right? So if we live in a skeptical age that's skeptical of any claim to truth, obviously the church is going to be the first target of that skepticism, because we make a claim to have this double truth, a truth from above that strengthens the truth that we can grasp from below and defend both. And so we ought to expect to be more and more persecuted the more skepticism spreads. Right? I think that's simply a given, and that's something that all the bishops are mentioning as well, and popes. And so, yes, in apologetics today, we have to defend the very notion of truth and argument and reasoning. I mean, it's that simple. And then there's something beautiful about that, no? Because if the stereotype that people have is that the church is the enemy of reason, seeing the church as the defender of reason can't but do good. But it's a huge task. It's a task that has to start with education. In other words, it has to start with, I would say, elementary and middle and education. We need to have the perennial philosophy in the schools. But the problem is the trend is the exact opposite.
You mean by perennial philosophy, Socrates, Plato, and
yeah, just the idea there is a truth. What is truth? Conformity of mind with reality. That we're capable of arriving at that truth by abstraction, by grasping the natures of things, and that we have the capacity to validly reason from premises that are certain to certain conclusions. That used to be simply what was meant by philosophy and science. But today that's no longer, that seemed to be a threat, because it seemed to be intolerant to defend reasoning. Because if you defend reasoning, you defend arriving at conclusions that you think are true, and therefore you think that the opposite is false. And that's politically incorrect. But the irony of it is, it's only our ability to reason that prevents totalitarianism. The imposition of it, in other words, the dignity of the human being is his ability to grasp truth through reasoning and to fight for that truth that he's grasped. Anyway, so yes, that's a huge part of the church's task today, is to defend even the most basic things about our ability to grasp first principles, and from those first principles to defend things like natural law. Okay. Yeah, it's gigantic. So the church has to be working on both fronts, defending revelation and defending reason. And that's why we need everybody. Right? That's why all the faithful have to each participate in that mission, each in his own place, according to his own specialty. Okay, regarding the harmony of faith and reason, could Vatican II be responsible for the resulting decline of faithful Catholics and the disconnect with the faithful, and how to get the harmony back? Well, you can't say simply that. No, that Vatican II is responsible for the loss of the harmony of faith and reason. What could be defended is that a bad interpretation of the Second Vatican Council has done harm in precisely that area of a loss of the harmony of faith and reason. But not the Council itself. The Council itself, in fact, defends the harmony of faith and reason in numerous, maybe not as clearly and concisely as the First Vatican Council, but nevertheless much more diffusely and in far more texts. The Second Vatican Council defends the harmony of faith and reason, nature and grace. And it would be that would be a talk all in itself, to go through the different parts of the Second Vatican Council that speak of that harmony of faith and reason in beautiful ways. And you could see it in all the different documents. So it's not the problem with the council itself, I hold, but very much a problem with what's called the spirit of the council, which I think is the absolute betrayal of what the council actually taught. In other words, the problem was the reception of the Second Vatican Council in the years after the council, in which a certain vision of what the council was put forth that didn't have anything to do or was so often in direct contradiction to what the conciliar documents actually taught.
You can kind of tell when people speak of the spirit of the council, they do not and will not read what what Paul VI said about the council, what John Paul said about the council, what Benedict said about the council.
Right. In fact, you could see the popes since the council, Paul VI, John Paul II, I'm skipping John Paul I because it was too brief, and Pope Benedict, and now Francis, all of them have seen their fundamental mission of their pontificates in different ways as the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. And so I think it applies it to John Paul II more than the others, simply because of the length of his pontificate and the number of encyclicals and documents he put forth. But basically what he did from beginning to end was implementing what he understood to be the fundamental mission given by the Second Vatican Council. And his understanding of it is in so many ways the opposite of what was put forth as the spirit of the council.
Could you kind of encapsulate the two? I've heard this idea, spirit of the council, and the only thing I've identified as is they have no dogmatic basis whatsoever.
The problem, it's too elusive a thing. In other words, it can be made to mean what different people want it to mean, and so how should we?
I'm trying to come up with the word that the translation was ambiguous when it wasn't meant to be.
Sure. All churches, right. So many people say that the documents of the Second Vatican Council were flawed by opening up ambiguity on certain fundamental questions. So even though the Council doesn't teach something contrary to the faith, by stating certain things in an ambiguous way, that's the charge that's very often made. What should we think about that? I think simply that that's always true of documents. Documents of the magisterium, even though they're assisted by the Holy Spirit, and sometimes use the full force of infallibility. In the Second Vatican Council, that wasn't used. But in any case, there's still the assistance of the Holy Spirit. That doesn't mean that things are said in the most perfect way possible so as to preclude all ambiguity. That's simply, I don't think, possible. And it's ultimately a prudential question. A prudential question, how to best phrase this to satisfy people on very opposite poles. Right? It's the hardest thing in the world to say something in a perfectly balanced way that defends against an interpretation coming from this side and a misinterpretation coming from the exact opposite side. That's very difficult to do. And sometimes we succeed better and sometimes less well.
Let's try out two words. Rupture and continuity.
Okay. So, again, Pope Benedict, one of his most important legacies was a talk that he gave to the cardinals, I think it was in 2005, the first year of his pontificate, before Christmas, in which he spoke of two fundamental ways of reading the Second Vatican Council. According to the hermeneutic, we could say the perspective of rupture, or according to the perspective of continuity. And he said, reading the council according to the perspective or hermeneutic of rupture is done on, in fact, both poles. It's done in one way by those who would classify themselves, I suppose, as liberals, to say that the Second Vatican Council had completely changed everything, and that's a good thing, and that's what we want. And it was also said by those on the opposite pole who agreed that it had changed everything, but just came to the opposite conclusion. That was a terrible thing. And Pope Benedict is saying both of those interpretations are utterly unecclesial, because the Church doesn't do that and can't do that. And you can't ever read a Church document thinking that, because the optic, the perspective we have to bring to every thing that Holy Mother Church gives us is that this was said in continuity with the before and after. So for us today, how do we read the Second Vatican Council? And this is a really important thing, given that this is the 50th anniversary of the calling of the Council. And Pope Benedict has given us, again, I think, the light on this in calling for a year of faith, right, which we're still in. And he, in his document proclaiming the year of faith, a beautiful, brief, Open the Door of Faith, he spoke of the Catechism as the hermeneutical key. And he said that the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published by design 30 years after the calling of the Council by John Paul II, is the best and most important fruit. That's a very large statement. Pope Benedict saw the Catechism of the Catholic Church as the most important fruit of the Second Vatican Council, and the touchstone that we've got the true spirit of the Council. In other words, distilling because basically that's why the Catechism, the New Catechism, was published, to include within the Church's catechetical teaching the developments of the Second Vatican Council. And the Catechism does this, as one should, in an organic way, putting those developments in the harmony of everything that came before, and also the things that came after, such as the Pontificate Humanae Vitae of Paul VI and all the encyclicals of John Paul II. Right? And so the Catechism does precisely the hermeneutics of continuity. And so that's a model for doing theology, and the fundamental resource that Pope Benedict envisioned this year of faith would center on. Unfortunately, I think we're going to get to the year of faith and without having accomplished that. So I think the Catechism is the way to... it wouldn't make sense to love the Catechism and to think that Vatican II was fundamentally flawed. Because the Catechism is the fruit of the Second Vatican Council.
You know, I think what happened in the documents I've read so far of Vatican II, many of them are asking for further investigation of some idea topic. And so that's not ambiguous. It's just saying, they're asking for further study or something.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's simply the life of the Church. The life of the Church is to ponder again and again the fundamental and the deposit of faith in the light of our life today. In other words, in the light of the challenges to that faith that come from the world in which we live. And since those challenges are different and more intense today, we ought to be reflecting more and more profoundly. And so basically that was the task that's the reason, the fundamental reason that John the 23rd felt called to call the Council. And that's just simply that the Church has to always do. Reflect more deeply on the faith in the light of the particular challenges of today. And, well, now those challenges are 50 years old. And so the encyclicals of the post-conciliar period carry that forward. And that will have to be carried forward until Christ comes again. I mean, that's simply the nature of the Church. But it can't be done without that perspective of continuity. Right? That's the key. And I think that's Pope Benedict's most important legacy. But obviously it's not new with Pope Benedict. It's Catholicism 101. It's the idea of tradition. Right? That's what tradition is. Passing on of what we've received to generation and generation. And it grows as you pass it on. That's the beauty. Because the Church is alive. The Church has a soul, the Holy Spirit. And so a life has to grow and develop. Which way now? Okay, another question. Is modernism the same as New Age? Oh, by the way, let me just one more thing about the Second Vatican Council. The fact is, the documents of the Second Vatican Council, I think, are very beautiful. No, deeply, profoundly beautiful. But they bear reading and rereading. They, just like any other treasure. And they have to be read. I think the best, again, as we said, the Catechism gives us the best perspective to read it. And it's also the best antidote for people who speak about the spirit of the council, that you've actually read it and you know what they say. And so you can say, I'm sorry, it doesn't say that. It says the opposite. You can't say that if you've never read them. Okay. Is modernism the same as New Age? Not exactly. Of course, both of them are umbrella terms that include all different types of things in them. Let me see if I can say in 5 minutes the essence of modernism. So modernism was a heresy that Pope St. Pius X identified, coined the term, more or less, modernism, and wrote a very important encyclical about it, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, in 1907. It's one of the great classics of the Church's magisterium. And what he describes is not simply a heresy like other heresies that picked out a particular thing, say, rejected a sacrament, rejected one aspect of Christology. But he saw modernism as an attack on the very foundations of the faith. In other words, something that belongs here with regard to fundamental theology. Modernism is ultimately an attack on the very notion of a revelation that comes from above. I'm oversimplifying, but to try and give a picture of it, the best way to understand modernism, I think, is that instead of seeing Catholic theology as ultimately from above, God's revelation to mankind, sees it, on the contrary, as the growth and development of man's religious instinct.
Like Daniel Dennett.
I'm not sure exactly, but it could take different forms and be more mitigated or more radical. But it's ultimately seeing religion as a product of man's religious sense. And a modernist will defend Catholicism as the true religion and as what everyone ought to embrace. It seems totally contradictory, no? How could you think that it's the true religion if you reject any notion of revelation? Well, they'll say that Catholicism is the religion that most encompasses the right development of man's religious instinct, and that Judaism was a stage in that development, etc. The prophets, but it's seeing the prophets fundamentally as great because they were grasping something, a further development of man's religious sense, rather than hearing God's word come from above. And so seen in that light, if modernism is fundamentally making that kind of claim, well, this is a danger far more radical than earlier heresies in the history of the Church. And that's why St. Pius X called it the synthesis, in some sense, of all heresies. And it's not as if that this was something that, existed in 1907, and St. Pius X wrote this encyclical and it disappeared. The fact is, it's the way practically everyone thinks. All right, that's an exaggeration. But not right. How much, I'm not sure. It's the default of simply the average person, I think, that religion is the product of our religious sentiment. And therefore, it's fundamentally a matter of sentiment. And this had its root first in the Protestant world, in what's called liberal Protestantism of the 19th century. So there's a particular philosopher, Schleiermacher, who first made this kind of claim, that he says, we've got three faculties: intellect to grasp truth, will with regard to morality, and sentiment with regard to religion. And religion is fundamentally a matter of man's religious sentiment, or sense, or feeling. In other words, seeing religion is fundamentally about the feeling of the sublime, the feeling of awe before God, rather than God who speaks and our receiving His word in faith. So that was kind of the origin of it in the Protestant world, and then that developed, and by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, began to also affect some Catholics. Not surprisingly, because
Which ones? Who?
So the principal modernist who got condemned was named Loisy, and he wrote a book on the church, basically denying that Christ founded a church. But he was much more radical, and it turns out he had lost the faith some 20 years earlier, and he was a Catholic theologian teaching and so forth who had lost the faith and was teaching modernism. And so, but at that time when St. Pius X wrote his encyclical, I'd say modernists were a small number in the Catholic world. I don't know, 50, 100 at that time. But today, how many think in this way? I mean, it's a problem that is enormously advanced, simply because that's the default of the modern world. That's what people think outside the church. And so what people think outside the church greatly tends to affect how we think inside. Tom?
Pope St. Pius, before he died, said that he thought that all he had accomplished by the oath against modernism and so forth was to drive it underground.
Right.
He realized this.
Yes. Right.
And this writer said that one of the things we can thank Second Vatican Council for is it flushed them out. And so now the modernism that was underground in Catholic schools,
right,
no
sure
one
can.
wanted to talk about. They would literally pass papers around among themselves, almost like spies in the Cold War, before Second Vatican Council. But after the council, they all came out in the open. And so I don't think it was a small number. I think it was a huge number.
Well, I think it was a growing number. But anyway, that's a historical question.
But,
I don't rightly know.
But yeah, read that encyclical. He talks about the modernist as a believer, the modernist as a theologian, and the modernist as a philosopher.
Right, and it strikes very close to home. In other words, if you read that encyclical written over 100 years, and a kind of tragic thing, I think, 2007 was the 100th anniversary. Usually we make a big thing about anniversaries in the church of important encyclicals. It went utterly unnoticed because it strikes too close to home. In other words, it paints a picture of me. I'm not just saying me personally, but of us and of what we have. Anyway, so yes, I very much encourage the reading of it.
William James' variety of religious experiences.
Yeah, that would be a part of it, sure. In other words, looking at it again at religion from the point of view of the religious sense. Yeah, that will belong in there. How is that different from New Age? Well, New Age is very similar in this, that it's about sentiment. It's about from below rather than from. It's just a particular kind of form of it, in which it's receiving certain influences from Eastern mysticism, etc. But it too is a fluid thing, and I don't know as much about it as I ought to be able to properly answer. But yeah, an infatuation with forms of prayer that more properly associated with pantheism and elements of superstition. And I think in an age dominated by naturalism, it's almost inevitable that superstition will come out. In other words, unreasonable forms of religiosity. Religiosity divorced from reason.
And there was an encyclical on the other, something water of divine life.
Oh, I'm not sure. Has the Eastern Orthodox Church digressed any in the understanding of the faith due to their not being in unity with the Church? Well, I would say that's inevitable. But again, this is very sensitive. So to the extent that they hold on to tradition, no, they're on firm ground. But to the extent that what tends to happen is the more recent determinations of the magisterium after the schism, so in other words, the magisterium from the second millennium, out of a certain kind of party spirit, tends to get rejected, even though in the tradition there's the roots of it all. But again, this is it would require a much longer answer. But sure, so the answer would be outside the church, it's inevitable, but the degree to which one holds on tradition will be a huge aid in any case. Does the Eastern Church theology use Greek philosophy as much as in the West? Unfortunately, no. And that's ironic because, again, I'm totally ignorant, but this is my impression, that the Eastern Fathers were much more philosophically oriented than the Western ones. So people in the first 5 centuries, philosophy was more cultivated in the East. I mean, because they had the Greek heritage. They could read the Greek philosophers in the original language, etc. Whereas the Latin writers tended to be more juridically focused, more interested in ethics, and less metaphysically oriented. So it was in the East that you really had that beautiful synthesis of faith and reason. In the West, St. Augustine. But tragically, after the separation, so at the beginning of the second millennium, there tends to be a kind of fideism that develops in the Eastern
Well, they were
tradition.
destroyed. I mean, all the centers of learning were destroyed by the Muslims.
True, but they did it in the East. They held on to it. In other words, for the in what was in the Dark Ages in the West, the 7th through the 10th, 11th century, it was in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, that those treasures were kept. And was the French Revolution a power grab against the church or a philosophical shift against it? All right, that's again, sorry, I can't do that. But no doubt, so I'm going to leave out the first part and just look at the second part. Was it? Yes, of course it was a philosophical shift against it. It was a philosophical shift. And the French Revolution was in large part deist in its orientation and very deeply anti-ecclesial and also opposed to any recognition of a public revelation. And this has huge consequences for us today because we're all living in a political structure and climate molded by the French Revolution, in which there's no space for the claim of any kind of public revelation and any social responsibility with respect to God. And that's huge, no? And that's, again, that would be a whole talk in itself. All right. By rupture, what are the proponents of the spirit of Vatican II wishing? And do they respect tradition? Well, they're all different degrees. And so, yes, somebody can be in favor of rupture to a certain degree and still respect some of tradition, that part of tradition that seems to coincide with the kind of rupture that they want. But, so I'm going to dodge this question, simply because it would vary greatly depending on who one is talking about, whether it's Hans Klung or...
Teilhard Chardin, I've read 2 of his books. They just look like science fiction theology.
Again, that's true. I'm going to dodge that question because it's too big for us, and because his work is very varied. But the fact is that the Church put out a warning with respect to the works of Teilhard de Chardin that was never taken away, and so the faithful are warned to be careful. In other words, not to read them, so as not to be confused about the foundations of the faith, such as original sin, and questions like polygenism and monogenism. On that note, I'm going to call it a night.